The series begins with a student named Julia, who attends a private school. Most of the students there are wealthy and come from good financial backgrounds, but Julia comes from a very poor family and was able to enter the school through a scholarship, so she doesn't have to pay tuition. She meets a new student named Hannah, who sees her sitting alone and asks her why. Julia explains that she is not on the same level as the rich students and tells Hannah that she can go make friends with other students and leave her alone. However, Hannah refuses and decides to be her friend. Julia then starts explaining the school system to Hannah and tells her about a strange game the students play called the red card. The game involves placing a red card in a student's locker, and the student who gets the card is taken to an isolated place where they are bullied. Julia explains that this game was created by a group of the strongest students in the school. Moments later, we see a student who received the red card being taken to the isolated place and getting beaten up by the students. The F4 group, the richest students in the entire school, are watching what happened. Julia witnesses this and gets upset, so she goes to the school roof to vent her anger. One of the F4 members hears her cursing the group but doesn't do anything, despite being the fourth member of the group. Julia then goes to talk to her friend Hannah about what happened and tells her that the F4 group is a threat to the school. Their boss at work overhears them and decides to help by researching the group on the internet. He informs them that the group's leader is named Tim, whose mother is very wealthy and owns many companies. We also learn that the second member is named MG, who loves partying and getting into trouble because his family is part of the mafia. The third member is named Kevin, who also loves partying and comes from a wealthy family. The last member, Ren, is an artist who doesn't like causing trouble with the students. When Julia returns home and sits with her parents, we learn that she has only one brother. Her mother wants her to marry someone rich from the school to improve their financial situation and live a better life. The next day, Julia is talking with Hannah when Hannah accidentally spills food on Tim's expensive shoes. Hannah knows the shoes are very expensive and starts crying while apologizing to him. Tim tells her to clean his shoes with her tongue, which makes Julia angry. Julia tells Tim to stop, and he agrees and walks away. Later, Julia opens her locker and finds a red card. The students see this and start filming the incident. Julia tries to escape to avoid being bullied, but fails and gets bullied. She goes to the roof again to vent her anger, and Ren hears her. Ren successfully saves her from the students who were bullying her and tells her to stay put. He advises her to go home after the school day ends. After Ren leaves, Julia realizes that he knew her name when she was screaming on the school roof. That night, Julia tries to escape from the school, but the bullies catch her and start bullying her again. Ren appears and rescues her for the second time, successfully driving the bullies away. He then sets off the fire alarm to alert the security guards about the bullies. His plan works, and they manage to escape from the school. Ren tells Julia to leave, and she returns home, where her family notices she is upset and has locked herself in her room. Meanwhile, Tim punishes the students who bullied Julia because he didn't ask them to do that, and the security guards saw them. His friend calms him down, telling him it's his fault because they don't usually give the red card to girls. Tim angrily declares that what happened will not go unpunished and that Julia will be his enemy from now on. When he returns home and finds his mother, she has returned from a trip and is aware of the problems he's caused. She is upset because she thinks he's a failure and asks how he plans to control her companies if he can't even control the school and make it bend to his will. Infuriated by her words, Tim leaves in his car, only to encounter a driver who annoys him. He gets out and beats up the driver and his friend. Meanwhile, Julia is sitting alone at home, feeling upset. Her family tries to cheer her up by giving her a new pair of shoes as a gift, knowing she had been going to school with worn-out shoes. Julia feels happy and grateful, as it's been a long time since she had decent shoes. The next day at school, some students take Julia's new shoes and make her chase after them until she encounters Tim, who then destroys her new shoes and throws them in the trash. Julia is devastated and in her anger, hits Tim, telling him she won't take orders from him anymore before leaving the school. The students are shocked by what they see, and some record the incident, which quickly spreads. The following day, as Julia is walking, some men kidnap her, but don't harm her. They take her to get cosmetic surgery. After the surgery, when Julia looks beautiful, Tim tells her that he's already spent $5 million and gives her the keys to a car worth $10 million. He wants her to apologize for what she did to him, but she refuses to accept anything from him, hits him, and escapes. Tim finds out and tells her he will give her all the money she wants, but his mother arrives and takes Julia out of the house. The next day at school, Julia learns that her reputation is being tarnished, and she starts feeling tormented. As usual, she goes to the rooftop to scream. Ren, who is on the rooftop, comes to calm her down. Julia sees him as different from his friends and thanks him for everything he has done for her. Later, Julia goes to her workplace and tells her friend King everything, mentioning that she is starting to like Ren. King, knowing that Ren is part of the F4 group, tells her that if she thinks Ren is different and likes him, there is no problem. That night, Julia meets her friend Hannah, who apologizes for the trouble she caused. Hannah feels guilty for not standing up to the bullies. Julia reassures her that she is not angry because they are friends. Moments later, Julia sees Ren looking at a model named Mira and tells him that she admires her and wants to be like her. Julia then returns to Hannah and they walk away together. Tim, who has been monitoring everything, realizes that Hannah is Julia's best friend. The next day, Hannah gets the red card and the students start bullying her. Tim, who orchestrated the plan, wants the students to cut her hair. Julia steps in to help her friend and demands Tim stop what he is doing. Tim tells Julia that she can apologize for what she did to him and that he will let Hannah go. Julia, refusing to apologize and humiliate herself, starts to cut her hair, but at the last moment, Ren intervenes and stops her. The bullies then apologize to Julia for what they did, recognizing her as a good person who sacrificed herself to save her friend. Julia forgives them, and they become friends. They invite her to a reception for the model Mira. The next day, Ren picks up Mira from the airport, revealing that they have been close friends since childhood. Julia attends the party with her new friends, but finds that the bullies start tormenting her again. They laugh at her and tell her that Ren will never look at her, then ruin her clothes. Ren arrives and gives her his handkerchief. Meanwhile, Mira scolds the bullies for their behavior and manages to push them into the water, ruining their appearance. Mira takes Julia to her room where they talk, and Mira reveals that Ren often talks about Julia and is likely interested in her. Julia is surprised because the bullies told her that Ren and Mira are in love. Mira reassures her that they are just friends and not to believe what others say. After giving Julia some of her clothes, Mira encourages her to join the party. Ren, who likes Julia, wants her to dance with them. Tim sees this and argues with Ren, warning him not to get close to Julia because she received the red card, and no one should befriend her. Mira tries to stop Tim, but he pushes her to the ground. This angers Ren, who starts fighting with Tim. Julia attempts to separate them, but accidentally bumps into Tim, causing him to fall. Embarrassed, Tim leaves the scene. The next day, Tim seems unusually happy, thinking about how Julia fell on him at the party. Julia visits Mira's house because she knows Ren is there. She finds Ren arguing with Mira about her plans to travel. Julia learns that Ren loves Mira and doesn't want her to leave. Ren starts following Julia and even buys the bus she takes to school. Julia confronts Ren and hits him, but his sister intervenes, taking Julia with her. She gives Julia her card and arranges for a driver to take her home. She then talks to her brother, explaining that she returned from her trip to look after their interests. The next day, Julia meets Ren, who is upset, and asks him what he'll do after Mira leaves. Ren tells her that Mira is his best friend, who defended him against bullying. He doesn't want her to leave him. Tim, who is watching them, learns of their conversation. Ren takes Julia to meet Mira, who asked to see her. Mira explains that her decision to travel is final, and Ren overhears everything. When Julia returns to Ren, he starts arguing with her, but Julia encourages him to stop Mira if he truly loves her. On the day of Mira's departure, Tim and his friends come to say goodbye. Julia also joins them. Tim realizes that Julia was right, and he decides to go after Mira, thanking her for everything. Julia feels a growing admiration for Tim, but wishes him happiness with Mira. Ren gets into an argument with Tim for not telling them about his plans to leave. Eventually, Ren reconciles with Tim and his friends, who are happy for him. Tim then talks to his sister, asking for advice on how to get closer to Julia and become her boyfriend. She advises him to ask Julia out. The next day, Tim appears on television, inviting Julia to take a walk with him. Julia, watching TV at school, is surprised and thinks he wants to bully her again. The following day, Julia goes out with her friend instead of meeting Tim at the arranged time. Doubting whether Tim is waiting for her, she decides to check the place he mentioned and finds him standing in the rain, waiting for her. Realizing he truly likes her and wasn't planning to bully her, Julia feels conflicted. They argue and start hitting each other, but eventually they go for a walk and spend the day together. Later, Julia takes Tim to a restaurant for dinner, but when she learns the food is expensive, she pulls him aside to talk. Tim reassures her that he's hungry and has no problem paying for the meal. But then they are surprised to find the door locked and unable to call for help. Tim starts to feel unwell because he was standing in the rain, and Julia takes care of him. The next day, an employee arrives and unlocks the door for them. Tim drives Julia home and tells her he wants to go out again. When Julia enters her house and talks to her family, she learns from her mother that her father has borrowed money and the creditors want to seize their home. Julia takes the money she has and goes to the man her father borrowed from. She tells him she will repay the rest soon. The man offers her a job at his club so she can pay off her father's debt. Julia is reluctant and scared, but he assures her no one will bother her and she can work comfortably. After agreeing to work there, Julia encounters a customer trying to get too close, but she stops him by grabbing his hand. She then scolds the employee present and tells him to inform his boss that she is quitting and will repay the money. The next day, Julia learns that a video of Tim dropping her off at her house has gone viral, and the students think they are in love. Julia wants to clarify the situation and deny any relationship, but Tim publicly announces to the students that they are indeed in love. The news of their relationship spreads throughout the school. When Tim talks to his friends, they warn him not to get close to Julia because his mother would not approve of him being with a poor girl. That night, Tim visits Julia's house, but her father scolds him for coming late. When Tim reveals his identity, Julia's father recognizes him as the son of a wealthy family and remembers seeing him on TV. Julia's father invites Tim in and they have dinner together. Tim appears happy to be with them. Meanwhile, Kevin, one of Tim's friends, visits Julia's workplace and tells her colleague, Kang, to keep Julia away from Tim. After dinner, Julia walks Tim out, but she drops the handkerchief that Ren had given her. Tim picks it up and shares the story of his childhood with Ren, explaining that he once wanted Ren's toy and accidentally broke it while trying to take it. Ren refused to apologize and ostracized Tim from their friend group. Despite this, Ren continued to play with him. Tim admits he was upset because Ren never apologized. Julia suggests Tim call Ren and apologize, but Tim refuses, fearing it will diminish his status. Julia teases him, calling him spoiled, and they end up playfully fighting and breaking a gate. Julia then asks Tim to leave, but he tells her he will see her at school the next day. At the same time, Tim's mother instructs her employees to monitor his movements. The next day, photos of Julia working at the club spread, and Tim confronts her. Julia initially lies, saying the photos are fake, but eventually admits the truth. Tim leaves feeling betrayed. Kevin and his friends decide to help Julia and find out who took the photos at the club. In the evening, Kevin goes to the club and fights everyone there. He then sits down with the club manager and asks who took the photos. The manager, realizing that Kevin is from the F4 group, becomes fearful and reveals everything. At the same time, Tim and his friend are at the club, as well as Hannah, Julia's friend. Hannah drugs Tim's drink, and while he is unconscious, she manages to take him away from his friend Angie. Julia later sees online that Tim is asleep next to a girl, but the girl has disguised herself, so Julia doesn't recognize her as Hannah. Hannah uses Tim's phone to send a message to the students, urging them to bully Julia again. The next day, Julia goes to school and finds the students bullying her. She learns that her friend Kang's machine was broken because of her. Angie talks to Kevin, revealing that Hannah took Tim from the club last night. They investigate Hannah and discover she is the daughter of the club manager and that she used to attend school with them under a different name and appearance. They try to warn Tim, but Hannah has his phone and hangs up the call. When Tim wakes up from the drugging, Hannah approaches him, but he pushes her away and refuses to speak with her. Hannah explains that she has loved him since childhood, but was rejected because of her appearance. She tells him she had plastic surgery and enrolled in the school to make him fall in love with her. She admits to causing all of Julia's problems, including the photos. Tim tells her he loves Julia and won't leave her. Hannah threatens to harm herself, but Tim stops her and gets injured in the process. He tells her that her actions won't change anything and that she needs to focus on herself and move on from the trouble she has caused. Later, the students set fire to Kang's machine, but Tim arrives just in time to save it. He apologizes to Julia for not giving her a chance to explain and takes her home to tend to her injuries. He reveals that Hannah was the one who betrayed her. Tim confesses his feelings to Julia while she is asleep, and she doesn't hear him. The next day, Julia finds out Tim has arranged several locations for her to choose from to give back to her friend. When Tim calls her, she learns he is busy punishing the students who bullied her. At school, Julia confronts Hannah and tells her she won't forgive her for what she did. Hannah listens without saying anything and decides not to return to school. Julia later finds a letter from Hannah apologizing for everything and old photos of them together, which makes her cry. Tim addresses all the students, warning them that he will destroy anyone who harms his girlfriend, Julia. Julia is shocked and tries to deny it, but Tim reminds her that she agreed when he talked to her while she was asleep. Julia says she doesn't remember and starts arguing with him, as usual. Ren, their friend who has returned from a trip, appears, and Julia later talks to her friend Kang, revealing that Ren tried to get close to her, leaving her confused. She realizes that Ren is in love with her and walks away. The next day, Julia has an argument with someone who says he tried to call her, but received no response. Julia explains that her phone was broken. Julia finds that Tim has given her a new phone so they can stay in touch. Initially, Julia doesn't want to accept the phone, but Tim insists until she finally takes it. She goes to the school rooftop to meet him and gives him the phone back, explaining that they are not in a relationship. Tim tells her he is fine being just friends, and that he doesn't mind if they fall in love eventually. Julia is frustrated with Tim's constant messages and talks to her friend Kang about it. Kang suggests that Julia should go out with Tim and that they can all go out together with their partners the next day. Julia approaches Tim and asks him to go out with her. Tim initially refuses and demands that she beg him since she ignored his messages earlier. They argue, but Tim eventually agrees to go out with her. The next day, they all go out together. Kang's boyfriend, Sam, is on the phone, and Tim overhears that Sam doesn't truly love Kang, but loves Julia instead. Furious, Tim confronts Sam, leading to a fight. Julia intervenes, stopping the fight, and tells Tim that he hasn't changed and is still hot-headed. Tim, feeling rejected, leaves and sits with his friends, who advise him to fix his relationship with Julia. Julia later hears on the news that Mira has gotten married. She goes to Ren, who confides in her about his feelings. He tells her he was happy with Mira, but let her go because he thought she deserved someone better. Julia reassures him that he is a good person and a great friend. Tim, witnessing this, becomes jealous and hits a student for no reason, declaring that Ren is no longer part of the F4 group. Julia tries to explain things to Tim, but he demands that she tells him she hates Ren to bring him back into the group. When she doesn't respond, he almost hits her, accusing her of loving Ren more than him. Tim's mother later visits him, demanding he stops associating with Julia, calling her a poor girl. Tim angrily dismisses his friends, wanting to be alone. Meanwhile, Kevin spends time with Julia, playing and having fun. Julia gets a call from Kong, who is waiting for her and Kevin at a restaurant. Kong sees her ex-boyfriend with another girl and gets upset. Kevin comforts her and makes her laugh, promising to take revenge. Kevin confronts the girl with Kong's ex, declaring his love for Kong, causing the ex to get angry and claim that F4 members like poor girls. Julia shows up and hits the ex, agreeing that Tim was right to hit him. The F4 members gather, and Tim tells Ren he no longer loves Julia. Ren, saying he will lie and use her, provokes Tim into a fight. Tim declares his love for Julia and that he will never leave her. Ren admits he provoked Tim to get him to confess his feelings. Julia arrives, learning that things are back to normal between the friends. She apologizes to Tim, who reassures her that he loves her and isn't angry. Tim explains his relationship with his mother, who taught him to be strong and in control. He tells Julia that falling in love with her changed his perspective and that he has decided to stop the red card game. The next day, Julia returns home to find Tim's mother there with security guards. Tim's mother offers Julia money to stay away from her son, but Julia's mother angrily throws her out of the house. Julia's father announces that he and her mother will be traveling to the countryside for work. After they leave, Julia starts looking for a job to take care of her younger brother. Tim confronts his mother, telling her he knows everything she did and that he will never abandon Julia, no matter what. After Tim talks to Julia, he tells her he has bought the house next to hers so they can stay close. Over time, Tim frequently wakes her up, needing her help with house issues. The next day at school, Julia learns that Tim's birthday is in 2 days. Later, she goes to Tim's statue and kisses it, where she meets a young man named Tally. It turns out Tally had helped her at the laundry before. Julia learns that Tally is a new student at her school. Tally walks her home and, knowing she needs a job, promises to help her find one. The next night, while talking with Julia, Tally asks her to count down the last 10 seconds of the year while he closes his eyes. When he opens them, Julia is the first person he sees in the new year. Julia starts baking cookies for Tim's birthday party. At the party, she meets Tim's mother, who insists that Julia stay away from her son. Julia firmly tells her she won't leave Tim and goes on to enjoy the party with him. Tim's mother then announces that he is engaged to a girl named Lita. Lita, who is present at the party, accidentally bumps into Julia, and both girls are shocked. Tim argues with his mother and in his rush mistakenly takes Lita instead of Julia in his car. Realizing the mistake, he drops Lita off, who insists he take her back. They argue, but he eventually returns her. The next day, students begin to bully Julia because Tim left with Lita at the party. Julia goes to the rooftop to scream and finds Tally there, who talks with her. Lita jumps over the school fence to escape security, and Julia helps her. Lita gives Julia a dress as an apology for tearing hers at the party. Julia returns home and eats with Tim and her brother. Tim explains everything, revealing his mother is behind the trouble. They then hear from the news that Tim's father is ill, so Tim leaves to check on him. Later, Lita visits Julia at work and invites her to go shopping. Julia brings Lita home, introducing her as Tim's favorite friend. Meanwhile, Kevin and Julia's friend Kang are getting closer. The next day, Julia learns that Tim's father has died. Tim tells her he will be away for a while to deal with it. During the funeral, Julia feels out of place and isolates herself. Ren asks Julia about Tim and Lita's engagement, and Julia reassures him that Tim loves her and won't let the engagement proceed. Tim tells Lita he loves Julia and won't continue with the engagement. Lita talks to Julia, admitting she didn't love Tim initially, but started to and feels hurt. Julia receives a call from Tally, who informs her he found her a job. They discuss the lives of rich people. The next day, Tim tells Julia he will solve the engagement issue with Lita. However, Tim's mother's employees arrive and take him away, revealing Julia had called them. Julia is sad, saying they must break up so Tim can live without problems caused by her. Julia then says goodbye to her brother, who is leaving for the countryside. Lita visits Julia at night, and they talk. Lita tells Julia that Tim came to her yesterday and asked her to be his girlfriend. Julia says she's happy for her, hugging Lita while feeling sad and crying. The next day, Julia talks to Ren on the school rooftop and calls her family to check on them. She learns that Tim is getting closer to Lita. However, Lita actually gets closer to Tim, and they start to argue. Later, they go to Julia and mock her, but Tally drops his books to distract them, making them leave. Julia and Tally joke around together, unaware that Ren is watching them. The next day, Julia rides with Tally to their new part-time job. Meanwhile, her friend Kang talks to her boss, who encourages her to confess her feelings to Kevin at the graduation party. At the graduation party, Julia sees Kevin preparing his speech. The F4 group is among the audience, and it's clear they are older than Julia. Lita and Tim go to the movies together, and she asks him to wait for her. At the same time, Julia is with Tally at the same location. Tally tells her to wait for him as he leaves for a bit. Ren is there too, secretly filming Tally talking to his friends. When Tally returns to Julia, Tim gets angry and starts a fight with Tally. Julia argues with Tim, hitting him, and Tim, feeling insulted, threatens to ruin her life. The next day, Julia finds out that Tim gave her a warning card, leading other students to bully her. Ren rescues her and calls Kevin to check the school's cameras. Kevin discovers that Tally placed the card, but gets knocked out before he can inform Ren. During the party with Lita, Tim receives a photo of Julia being kidnapped. The gang sends him an address to rescue her, and he leaves the party to save her. Tally explains to Julia that he wants revenge on Tim for bullying his friend who ended up in a psychiatric hospital. Tally asks Julia to help him with his plan against Tim. Tim arrives and sees Julia tied up. Tally demands Tim confess his wrongdoing in the card game to let her go. When Tim admits it, Tally's friends attack him. Julia tries to stop Tally, but he ignores her and continues beating Tim. When Tally picks up a chair to hit Tim, Julia breaks free and shields Tim, taking the blow herself. Tally remembers his friend defending him and starts crying, unable to continue. Julia wakes up in the hospital and learns from her friend that Tim is in critical condition. Julia visits Tim and sees his friends crying, thinking he's dead. It turns out it was a prank, and she hits Tim, who then confesses his love for her. Leda overhears the conversation and drops the flowers she brought. Ren visits Tally's hospitalized friend, learning that they plan to apologize to all the students they bullied. Tally doubts they'll be forgiven, but Ren insists they must try. Tally decides to post a video confession of his and Tim's misdeeds. Later, Julia talks to Tim, who admits he planned to expose himself but took the phone from Tally to do it himself. Julia argues with him about punishing himself, but then she receives an apology message from Tally. He asks her to tell Tim that the video was not shared publicly, just on his private account. Realizing the video didn't go viral, Tim decides to be a better person. They are happy and joke around. While playing, Julia accidentally knocks over a vase, breaking it. At that moment, Leda enters and is surprised by what she sees. However, the head maid tells her that Julia is Tim's maid. Later, Julia thanks the head maid for saving her and explains that she didn't lie, promising to work to repay the cost of the vase. Julia starts working at Tim's house, becoming his maid and preparing his meals. One day, while working, she injures her hand. Tim comes to help her, and Julia looks at him, imagining Leda, which makes her scared, so she leaves. The head maid treats Julia's injury and tells her the vase wasn't expensive and that she's sure now Julia is kind-hearted, which is why Tim loves her. Meanwhile, Kevin is helping Kang with her work, showing he's growing more fond of her. Tim talks to Leda, telling her they need to break up. Leda refuses, saying she won't let him go and that she's spoken to her father, who wants Tim to live with them. Leda asks Julia to fetch her bag, and as Julia complies, the head maid gives her a list of items to buy. At the same time, Leda tells Tim she loves him, but he tells her he loves Julia, causing Leda to cry. The next day, Tim visits Leda and her father. Leda complains to her father, falsely claiming that Tim hit her. She tells her father she wants to break off the engagement. As Leda recalls memories with Tim, she becomes emotional and cries. Her father comforts her and speaks to Tim, confirming that there's no longer any reason to keep the engagement. Kevin then speaks with Kang, telling her about his breakup with Leda. A customer at Kang's shop seems to recognize Kevin, making her suspicious. Later, Leda sends Julia a video apologizing for everything and telling her she's going to the US. Julia goes to the airport to bid her farewell, and they reconcile. Julia returns to Tim and tells him she wants to continue their relationship. Tim gives her a necklace he had given her before. The next day, Tim talks with his friends at the playground, who advise him to surprise Julia and get closer to her. We learn that Tim had Julia prepare a party as a surprise for her, which surprises his friends. Angie and Ren notice Kevin is upset and leave him alone. Angie explains to Ren that Kevin met his first love, Mona, which upset him because he still hasn't gotten over her. Julia talks to her friend Kang, who is upset, and asks her to share what's bothering her. Kang explains that Kevin distanced himself, saying he didn't deserve her. We learn that Kevin had told Kang everything about his past with Mona. Kang hesitated to tell Julia about Kevin's story, but warns her to be careful. Tim later talks to Julia, finding her discussing Kevin and her friend. He explains more about Kevin, telling her about his childhood love, Mona. We learn that Mona helped Kevin with everything, seeing him as a friend, while he loved her but was afraid to confess. One day, Kevin argued with Mona and left her because she talked about her boyfriend. Mona tried to reach out to Kevin, wanting to meet him at a specific building, but he never responded and stayed away. Back in the present, Tim tells Julia that Kevin hasn't met Mona since then. Meanwhile, Kang, aware of Kevin's story with Mona, searches for the building where Mona wanted to meet Kevin. The next day, we see Julia attending the surprise party Tim organized for her. However, she is upset due to a call from Kang, who informs her that security has arrested her. Julia rushes to help Kang, and they manage to get her to the roof of the building. Meanwhile, Mona is talking with Kevin and he notices a ring on her finger, realizing she is married. Kang, after a long search, finally finds the building Mona had mentioned and informs Kevin she wants to meet him there. When Kevin arrives with his friends, Kang explains why Mona wanted to meet him and how she had intended to confess her love that day. Kevin realizes that a sign's shadow on the roof would have spelled out, "I love you," revealing Mona's feelings. Kevin then confesses his feelings to Kang and later sits with her in the car, telling her he loves her. When Julia returns home, she finds out that Tim's mother has seized her house and started removing the furniture. Tim arrives and argues with his mother over the phone, but she refuses to stop, claiming she bought the house with her own money. Tim, frustrated, talks to his friends who offer to help him with anything he needs. Julia goes to her friend Kong, and her manager, learning about what happened, offers her an empty room to stay in. Julia then speaks with Tim, who tells her he won't return home and will stay with his friend Ren, trying to win his mother's approval for the girl he loves. Julia reassures him of her love. Meanwhile, Tim's mother fires the head maid for supporting Tim's relationship with Julia. The maid informs Tim about this, telling him that his mother will do anything to keep him away from Julia. Tim then discovers his mother has frozen all his accounts and intends to disown him. At the same time, Julia's workplace is destroyed by Tim's mother's employees. Feeling she is harming everyone around her, Julia confronts Tim's mother, agreeing to leave Tim if she fixes everything she destroyed. Tim's mother reveals she has cancer and is trying to make Tim strong enough to manage the companies after she dies. Julia, moved by her story, decides to leave Tim for his future. She meets with Tim and tells him she is breaking up with him. Tim suspects his mother's involvement, but Julia lies, saying she took money to leave him. Tim, knowing Julia well, calls her a liar. Julia insists she planned everything from the start and finally reached her goal of getting money. Tim, heartbroken, doesn't believe her but leaves when she returns his necklace. Julia cries as she leaves, planning to return to her hometown. The headmaid encourages her not to give up and to come back to Tim. Julia, aboard a train, takes the necklace with her. Meanwhile, Tim's mother finds out Julia has left, and Tim has started working again. It's revealed that Tim's mother was lying about her illness. A year later, Tim's friends have entered university, and Kevin is closer to Kong. Ren searches for Julia everywhere, asking around her hometown. Tim, now working in his office, talks to his sister. His mother calls him for an important job, and they end their dealings with a company, making someone angry enough to threaten legal action. Tim's mother assures him they will win, as they have all the necessary documents. Tim sees a TV report about Julia's father, complaining about their poor financial condition as farmers. The next day, Ren visits Tim, telling him about Julia and her family's financial struggles. Tim initially refuses to help, believing Julia took the money and left. Ren argues that Julia wouldn't be poor if she had taken the money. After fighting with Ren and receiving Julia's address, Tim is advised to reconsider and not lose the woman he loves. When Julia returns home, she finds the villagers demanding their money. She tries to reason with them, but they are unwilling to listen and attempt to take anything from the house. At that moment, Ren arrives and pays off her father's debts, surprising Julia as she wonders how he found her. Ren explains that he saw her father on television and tracked her down. Julia prepares a meal for Ren, and they talk, with Ren affirming that she is his best friend and promising to always support and protect her. Meanwhile, at Tim's company, a group of employees shows up, upset about the dissolution of their partnership, which resulted in them losing their jobs. The company's owner pleads with Tim to restore the alliance, but Tim refuses and has security escort them out. Tim, moved by the situation, discusses the matter with his mother, who insists he should follow her lead and not intervene. Ren begins to help Julia with her work and decides to take her and her brother on a walk. Julia talks to Ren about her job while her brother heads to the beach, and they all enjoy their time playing by the water. Later, Julia confides in her brother about their mother's exploitation of multiple companies for personal gain. She urges him to rectify their mother's wrongdoings. Their mother intervenes, arguing that managing the companies requires intelligence and skill during this time. Ren confesses his love to Julia and proposes, saying he wants to marry her. Julia, however, cries and admits she cannot be with him because she has not moved on from Tim. Ren laughs, revealing he was joking to get her to confess her feelings for Tim. He shows her his phone, displaying a picture of Tim and his friends, and tells her about Tim's ongoing love for her. Julia learns from Kang that Tim's mother lied about having cancer. Ren then takes Julia out of town. Meanwhile, Tim is in a meeting, trying to reform the company's operations. After presenting a new business plan, he gains the approval of all the clients, despite his mother's frustration with his actions. Tim destroys the contracts and documents his mother created, deciding to run the company his way. After leaving the meeting, Tim bumps into the company owner who lost money because of him. The owner attempts to attack Tim's mother, but Tim intervenes and gets injured. Julia, witnessing this, fears for Tim. Tim is taken to the hospital, and his mother, uninterested in his condition, instructs her assistant to focus on work. Tim's sister overhears this and confronts their mother, reminding her that Tim sacrificed himself to save her. Ren receives a call informing him that Tim has woken up from his coma. Julia rushes to the hospital but finds that Tim's mother is refusing visitors. The doctor informs Tim's mother that Tim fell and might not remember the last 4 years. The doctor believes Tim's memory could return over time. Tim's mother shows him pictures of his friends, which he recognizes. However, when she shows him a picture of Julia, he does not remember her, leaving his mother pleased. Julia visits Tim, trying to comfort him, but he yells at her, claiming he does not know her. Shocked and heartbroken, Julia learns from Tim's sister about his condition and their mother's plan to exploit the situation, and she started to hide anything related to him. After he returned home, we learned that his mother prevented anyone from contacting him and put him under surveillance because she wanted him to regain his strength and manage the company again. We also learned that she was withholding his medication, throwing it away, and didn't want him to recover or remember Julia. During this time, we see Julia sitting with his friends, who tell her they will help her. After his mother leaves the house, he is surprised to see Julia appear suddenly. We learn that his friends helped her get there. Julia starts showing him pictures of them together, trying to make him remember her, but he thinks she's tricking him and calls security. Julia tries to calm him down, but ends up hitting him, and they start arguing. At that moment, Tim begins to remember some things, but can't fully recall. Tim's mother returns home, orders her staff to remove Julia, and tells her to stay away from her son. Julia accuses his mother of not loving her son, only pretending to care. His mother hits Julia and throws her out of the house. Julia stands in the rain for a long time, and we see that Tim's sister is upset for her. His mother then tells Julia to leave her house. Julia tells her that she never cared about her son's happiness and that Tim was happy with her and wanted to live with her. Tim's mother begins to recall her memories with Tim and realizes she was distant from him. She starts to be moved by Julia's words. Tim appears, and Julia leaves the place, crying about what's happening to her. After Tim finds the necklace that fell from her, he starts to remember their memories together and wants to go to her and learn her story. We notice then that his mother isn't stopping him and asks the security to open the door. When Tim reaches Julia, he wants her to remind him of herself. Julia tells him everything, and they realize they loved each other. Tim apologizes to Julia for all the trouble she went through because of him. Julia realizes he remembers her and is very happy. Kevin's friends see a picture of Tim with Julia and know he remembered her, and they are all very happy. Days pass, and we learn that Julia's family returned from the countryside. They see Tim on TV talking, and Julia remembers when Tim told her he was going to complete his education to manage the companies and succeed. We also learn that his mother was happy because he was going to study abroad, and she changed her way of thinking, wishing him happiness. We also learn that their friends kept taking her to school and the card game ended, and everything returned to normal. Then comes the graduation ceremony. We learn that Tim sent her a dress from America. Julia helps her family with their broken car, and her brother gives her the dress, but it falls to the ground and gets dirty. Tim's friends are looking for her because she is late. Julia finally arrives at the party, realizing it has already ended, but then she finds cards with a plan drawn on them. She follows the plan and meets Tim's friends, who help her talk to Tim via video call. Tim sees her not wearing the dress and asks about it. She tells him it fell and got dirty. He tells her she looks beautiful in anything she wears and starts talking to her. She then sees his friends appear in the video and realizes Tim is nearby. He surprises her by coming back to celebrate with her, promising he won't be late again. Julia realizes the party isn't over and celebrates with them, feeling very happy. Julia begins to talk about the group and says that 4 young men changed her life for the better. She was happy with their friendship and said each one had different qualities, especially the one she loved and decided to stay with. That's all for today's video. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button and check out our other selection of recaps. Take care.